Hello everybody and welcome back to another video in our book tracking application series. And in this series we've been taking a bunch of different Jetpack libraries and putting them together into one app so that we can create an app that's a little more useful and interesting. And if you're just joining us in this video, you can grab the starting code for this video in the link down in the description below. And if you've been following along in this series, you can simply use your code that you have from the previous video. So basically, if you look at our app here, you can see we've got our list of books that we pulled in from our online database using our retrofit. We've got all of this data stored in our room database. We implemented Dagger Hilt for dependency injection. We implemented clean architecture best practices to organize our project a little bit more. And now you might think, hey, we're done. We are ready to move on, check the box, publish this app, and move on to the next project. And it's tempting to think that, but no, not yet. There's one very important step that we need to do before we move on, and that's testing, right? We need to develop a way to verify that this application here does what I think it's supposed to do. And I don't necessarily want to go through and click on every single one of these and then check every single checkbox here and verify all of the data integrity along the way. That is going to be a lot of work. And even for a small app like this, that's going to take a while. But for a bigger app, for a much more complicated app, that could take endless amount of hours. So we need a way to test our code, and we want to automate that as best we can. So what we're going to do in this video, we're going to focus on functional unit tests, specifically functional unit tests for our UI. And then in the next video, we'll talk about functional unit testing for kind of our logic and our Kotlin code itself. So basically, we're going to write some code in our project so that that code can then test our code that we already have written. And if it sounds a little weird writing code to test our code, don't worry, this is by far the most efficient way to do this. So a unit test focuses on the verification of just a small contained piece within an application, like maybe a ViewModel class, or maybe even just a function within that ViewModel. In this video, we're going to be looking at testing some of our screens within our presentation. So we'll look at this book list presentation screen and verify that the screen is updating correctly based on the state and various other things. Now, there are some bigger picture ways of testing applications that involve like integration testing. So making sure that everything, all of the different pieces are working together. But in this video, we're going to do just functional testing, which is testing the individual pieces on their own and verifying their behavior. There's also some end-to-end testing where you test the data all the way through the application and just verify that everything from the input end all the way to the database online and then the local cache and then what the user sees back on their screen, just testing everything is working. And that's good and that's helpful, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. We're only looking at unit tests for verifying just individual pieces of our app. So you'll notice over in our project window, you have, well, initially you had three. If I just collapse that one, you have this top com. So in our application, you've got this top com, which leads down to eventually all of our code that we've written so far. But then you've got all of these other com folders down here. So basically, these three yellow ones were generated by Dagger Hilt just automatically. And that's fine. We need those for sure, but not for this video. And then you have this com Android test, and then you have com test. So what are these two folders for? Well, basically, this Android test up here is going to be any test that you need a running application on an Android phone to verify. In our case, this is going to be like for UI testing. If you need to verify that something's actually displayed on the screen, well, then you need an Android screen, and thus you need an Android instance running. And then down here, this com test, this is strictly for testing just Kotlin code or Java, but in our case, Kotlin code. So if you have like a view model and you're verifying the functions within your view model, you could put all of those tests in here because all you're doing is you're testing the input and the output of these functions and verifying that they're behaving like you expect them to. And you don't actually need the UI up and running to test that. So in this video, we're going to mainly be working inside of this COM Android test folder. Now let's get started with actually testing our UI. And basically, we're going to need to verify that the composables that we've created in here are actually receiving and responding to the state that they're supposed to be properly. So let's go have a look at our book list screen really quick. And you'll notice we get a state in here, but there's actually no reference to the view model. Now, there was a reference to the view model earlier, and if you remember, I said that we were going to move that view model out, and basically we're not passing in a view model anymore. We're passing in rather our state instead of the entire view model. And what that is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to test this book screen independent from the view model, which is important for functional unit testing. You want to test small pieces of your application independently of each other. And then after that, we're going to go back and do kind of the more integration test where we're bringing all the pieces together and verifying the data flows and the end-to-end content and all of that after the fact. But luckily, up to this point, we've had the foresight to go ahead and keep the composables that make up our application and their respective view models pretty much not dependent on each other. Before you get started on anything, you actually need to go into your Gradle file. So let's open up our application level Gradle file and come down here. And you need to verify that you have the dependencies that you need. And if you look here, right here, we have Android test implementation, compose UI, UI test JUnit. So this is exactly what we need for testing. So we don't need to add anything in here. So let's go now up to our Android test package, and we're going to create a new file in there. So do new Kotlin class or file, and I'm going to name this book screen test. And actually, real quick, let me show you in this other file, example instrumented test. You can see that we already have a test class that was created by default by our program. And Android Studio just kind of gives this to you as a demo for what a unit test is going to look like. You can see you've got an at-test annotation. You've got a run with Android JUnit annotation. And then you've also got just kind of this function that they're running down here, and then they're running an assert statement, which is going to verify, in this case, just the package name of our application. So basically, all of our tests are going to kind of follow this general pattern. We're going to have tests, we're going to have a function, and then inside that function, we have what we want to test, and then our assertion statement. So back in our book screen, let's go ahead and add some code to that. So let's do get, we're going to add a rule, and basically we're going to say val test rule of type compose content test rule equals create compose rule. And since we are using this JUnit testing framework for our unit test, we're actually able to create test rules that that's going to allow us to add additional functionality to all of our tests within this class. So this specific rule is basically going to host the test on the Android device so that we could test our Compose UI. And our test code is going to be able to interact with the composables while it's running on that device. Before we continue on with this test, let's actually look back at our application so that we can see the behavior that we want to test. So let's go back up to bookscreen.kt, and you can see here we've got our state that we're going to be consuming. And then we've got on item click and on finish click, which are two functions, callback functions that we're sending back to our receiver. In this case, that's going to be our view model. But if we go into our book screen state, let's just have a look at what that looks like. So we've got our books, which is just going to be a list of books. initially, we're expecting that to be empty, at least until our either we get it from our retrofit instance or we get it from our local room database cache. And then we have an isLoading, which we're expecting initially to be true, because if it hasn't got the list, it should be loading, and then an error state. So basically, if we were to thoroughly test this, it wouldn't actually be that hard. We need to verify that the initial state that we pass into our view model shows an empty list, and it shows that our books are loading, or rather our composable is loading, and that our error is null, so there's no errors. And then after that, the next state is going to be the books have loaded, and then is loading should be flipped back to false, and error should still be null. And then finally, if you're going to thoroughly test the state, you need books and then is loading to be whatever, and then error. If error is set to something, you need to verify that that error is displayed on our screen. Because if you look in our composable, you've got this box, and in that box you've got if is loading, then we're going to display the circular indicator, and if state is error, then we're going to display the text down here. So we need to test all of these. First, let's just start with the initial state, which is going to have is loading set equal to true. Let's go ahead and do that back in our book screen test. I'm going to make a new function down here, annotate it at test. And this is going to be fun. Initial state is rendered, and this is just to verify that our initial state renders properly. And this is the basic naming convention that we're going to use. We're going to do the state under test, which here is going to be our initial state when we load the app, and then the behavior under test, which here is going to be our screen being rendered with that initial state. And then down here, we're going to say test rule, which is this test rule that we created up here, dot set content. And then inside of here, we're going to say book tracker theme. And if you named your project differently, so my project is named book tracker, and thus the theme that it generates automatically is book tracker theme. But if you named your project differently, then this theme might be named differently as well. So you might need to double check that one. Now in here, all we're going to do is say state, well, actually, we're going to make a book screen. And then within the book screen, we're going to say, let's see, let me space that out a little bit. And then we're going to have state equal to a book screen state. And in there, we're going to have books equal to just an empty list, because initially we have no books, and is loading is going to be equal to true. And on finish click, I'm just going to leave as an empty function because we don't need that. And basically every test that we run is going to need to be annotated with that at test annotation that you see up there. So here for the initial state when it's loaded, basically what we need to be checking, if you look back in our book screen, we need to be verifying that this circular progress indicator is actually loading. Now to do that, when you're testing a Compose UI, you can identify the different nodes within that UI or the different elements within that UI by their properties, or in this case, we're going to call them by their semantics. For example, if I have this text field here, and I want to check if this text field is visible, what I need to do, because I don't have an ID for this text field, what I need to do is say the text field that has the text equal to state.error. If that's visible, then we can verify our test. But up here on my circular progress indicator, you can see I don't have any text field inside of there. I don't have any parameters at all. And basically, we need to fix that so that we can determine if this circular progress indicator is in fact visible when our state says it should be. And the way that we do that is we're going to add a modifier. So modifier equals modifier dot, and again, I said these are called semantics. So within the semantics, we're going to say this dot content description equals, and I'm just going to call this loading indicator. And basically now, because we have this field inside of our circular progress indicator, we can go ahead and verify that the circular progress indicator with the loading indicator inside of its content description is visible. But we're going to need to actually access this string from our test as well, down here, our book screen test. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to pull that string out of there, and in my presentation package up here, I'm going to make a new Kotlin class or file, and I'm going to call this content descriptions and make it an object. So a content descriptions object. And then in here, all we're going to have right now, at least, is going to be a constant value loading indicator. And that is going to be equal to that string. So now, if I go back to my book screen, I'm just going to set this equal to content descriptions dot loading indicator. And once that is set, basically, we just need to come back to our book screen test and check if we have a loading indicator visible with that content description. We need to add a second test rule down here. So this first test rule is actually creating our book screen. And then our second test rule, we're going to verify that our book screen loaded how we expected it to, given the state that we passed in. So test rule dot on node, this one here, on node with content description. And basically all we need to do is say content descriptions dot loading indicator, and after this dot assert is displayed. Now in the project window on the left hand side, we can simply right click on that and we can say run book screen test. And you can see that that test passes. So that's really all that we need to do for unit test. So now we can continue on and go ahead and set up the next test that we need to do. But if we're going to try testing our screen when it's actually populated with data, we're going to need some data. And we don't really want to pull that data from Room or from Retrofit, because that's going to be quite inefficient and it's going to cause our tests to take a long time to run, whereas they should be running in just a split second, a few milliseconds. We don't want it to do a network or an HTTP or a Room database call during our test. So what we can do instead, I'm going to come back up here to my book tracker application, and I'm going to make a new object again. So new Kotlin class or file. This is going to be an object, and I'm just going to call this mock data. Now inside this mock data object, I'm just going to have a function, and it's going to be fun get domain books, which the domain book, if you remember, is how we display. It's the information that we use to display our book inside of our application. And this is going to be an array list of, and then basically I need to add a bunch of book objects here. I'm just going to copy and paste them and then import that. You are welcome to either copy and paste that from my GitHub, or you can simply pause the video here and type that out. And now we need to go back to our book screen test. And now that we have this one tested, let's go ahead and make a second test. So down here, we're going to say at test, because again, we want to mark this function as a test. We say fun content loaded state is rendered. And then we can use that function that we just created, val books equals mock data dot get domain books, and then test rule dot set content. And within here, we're going to have a book tracker theme again. And we're going to have a books screen. And then this book screen, of course, needs a state. So our state is going to be equal to a books screen state. And in there, our books is going to be equal to our books that we just loaded in. And then we need to set that is loading, which is now equal to false. And then finally, for this book screen, we also need to pass in that on finished click. And again, I'm just going to set that equal to an empty function because we're not testing that right now. All we're testing is that the data is displayed. And then after that, we need to make another test rule down here. And this is going to be test rule dot on node. Instead of content description this time, we're going to say on node with text. And here I'm just going to pass in the first book from my array list of books. And then I'm going to say books dot title dot assert is displayed. Whoops, what did I do here? I have an extra pair of parentheses there. So there we go. On node with text, and then I'm going to copy that one, paste it, and instead of title, let's change that to author. And then after that, I also need to verify one more thing, and basically this content description or this loading indicator, our circular progress indicator, we want to verify now that that actually went away. So what we're going to do, instead of saying is displayed on that, we're going to say assert does not exist. There's another one for is not displayed, but we don't want to do that because if you look in our book screen, this circular progress loading indicator is only called from within an if statement. So if is loading is true, then we're going to call that. But if it's not true, then not only will this not be visible on the screen, it won't even exist on the screen. So we won't be able to use that is not displayed. We can simply do it this way because this hasn't even been created this time around. And another thing I'll mention here, you can see we're only checking this for the first book in our list. And that's because if you have, basically this assert is displayed, that is checking if my item is displayed on the visible screen, right? So if I have an item that's way down off the screen, because say I have a list of, I don't know, maybe 20 items, and I check number 20, well, if I run that on my phone, that's going to fail because that item is not displayed on the screen. But if I were to pull up my tablet and run that same test, it might actually pass because the bigger screen size allows that to be displayed. And basically, we don't want that behavior. What we want is we want it to pass every single time, assuming that it's actually doing what we want it to do. We don't want the screen size to mess with that. So that's why we're only actually checking the first one. You could check 1 or 2 or 3, but I would be careful to check anything that might end up displayed on the screen on one phone and then not on another phone, depending on the size. Let's go ahead and run that test again. So again, just right click on that and do run. And now you can see both of those tests actually pass. So far, so good. Now we want to add one more test rule here. Basically, if I click on one of my books on the application, I want to verify that the item that I click on, the book that I click on, gets sent back to the caller. And I want to verify that the right callback function is called. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and write one more function down here. Again, annotate it with @test. This is going to be fun content loaded state. And this is going to be click on book is registered. So up here, right, we have content loaded state is rendered correctly. And then we have the same content loaded state and then we have the action, and then the behavior that we're expecting. So now, within that test, we're going to do the same thing. Val books equals books equals mock data dot get domain books, and then val target equals I'm just going to say books 0, so the first one in the list, and the target is going to be the one that we're verifying is actually working. Test rule dot set content, and then inside there again we're going to have the book tracker theme, and then inside there again we're going to set up our book screen. And let me just space that out a little bit more. And here we are going to do state equals book screen state, and then inside of that books equals books, and then is loading. We're going to set that equal to false. The on finished click, we're still just going to leave an empty function, because again, in this test, we're not actually testing whether this checkbox works or not. What we want to check is if I click on one of these books, does it then call the right callback function? So after we've got on finish click set up, we're going to add our callback for the on item click. So on item click, and this is going to be equal to, in here, I'm going to give that a name, ID, and we're going to say assert ID equals target book dot ID. Whoops, I guess I just named that target. So assert ID equals target dot ID, and basically what we're testing here is if I were to come in here and click on A Christmas Carol, which is going to be book 0 in our list, does the ID of the book I clicked on actually match the ID that I passed back to the caller? And then finally, after the set content, in here we're going to say test rule dot on node with text, and then this is going to be target dot title dot perform click. So here's where we're actually doing that click, and then here is where we're verifying that that ID is going to match the expected ID. So if we go ahead and again right click and run our test, we should see that now all 3 of our tests load. Sorry, not load. Of course they load, but all 3 of our tests actually passed. And that means we've now verified that our initial state is loading correctly. We've also verified that our content loaded is rendering correctly. And now we've verified that if I click on one of those items, on one of those books, basically it's passing the correct ID back to the calling function. So there's obviously more that you could do here that you could test, right? We haven't verified our error state. So if I reach out to the network for an HTTP call and I get nothing back, and then my cache is empty and I have an error, well, in our code, it says we need to display that text. So here we're not actually verifying that that's displayed. If we want to thoroughly test this application, we would. We're also not verifying that basically that this toggle, we're also not verifying that this toggle button on these for marking books off as finished, we're not verifying that that works. So there's a few other things that we could and really should test if we're gonna accurately test our entire application. And then beyond that, we've only looked at the book list, right? We haven't looked at the book details screen at all. So if you want some homework here and some fun things to do, you can sit down and write all of the UI tests, the remaining ones for the book list screen, and then the remaining ones that would be necessary for the book details screen as well. But this is all that I'm going to write for this video because I'm just introducing you to the concept. We don't need to go totally thorough and test absolutely everything in this application because, again, this application is really just for learning purposes. I'm not publishing this anywhere. So hopefully you've found this video helpful. I'm going to put the starting code and then this ending code as well in the link in the description below. And if you benefited from this video, then definitely like it and then subscribe to our channel. And we will see you in the next video where we're going to talk about how we can write unit tests, not only for the Compose UI, which we did in this video, but rather for our Kotlin code, which is going to be just our application logic, which is going to be like our view model and our use cases, because we need to test all of those as well. Like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any additional content that we put out, and we will see you in the next and final video in this series.